Hi y'all, this is Albert, pronouns he, him, his, and we're back with another video for my reading project, Raising Souls. And today we're going to be talking about Angela Davis, Women, Race, and Class. So first of all, happy Women's History Month. So this is like a perfect book to read for Women's History Month. You learn a lot of history about specifically Black women's contributions to labor movements, the abolition of slavery, and so many other things that our society pretty much runs up on, and we have certain protections because of these movements. So yeah, let's get into it. I don't feel like I have to introduce Angela Davis since I already have a video about her Are Prisons Obsolete book, which is another great book that she wrote. So, Women, Race, and Class, to give you some backstory on this, this was released, I think, in 1981. So it was a different time than today. We have so many new concepts and theories since then, but this gave like a good foundation of, say, like intersectionality for those who know that concept and understand the framework that it has. Angela Davis kind of pretty much says intersectionality without having the term intersectionality without this. So this is a really good foundation for something like Kimberly Crenshaw's work and other Black feminist works. So let's get into it. So the first chapter is titled "The Legacy of Slavery: Standards for a New Womanhood." So a lot of what this chapter discusses is talks about the significance of compulsory labor of female slaves. So sometimes so back during slavery, sometimes the female slaves had to work so much harder than the male slaves. Like they have to pick more cotton than the men. Sometimes they have to do all this they had to do all this housework. They had to do all the cooking, the cleaning, the planting, the farming, the washing, the food growing, sharecropping, and all of that stuff. Like women are notable for doing those type of jobs more intensely than men, and sometimes they don't even get paid at all for the labor that they had to do. So and that kind of like explains the evolution of detailing the experiences of Black women, um, and and when it comes along with those compulsory labor, there's a lot of abuses that they had to endure and face, such as sexual violence. There was forced reproduction. So even if a woman doesn't want to have a child, they're like really forced to have children, and sometimes that is because of the result of rape and forced sterilization and other things. So because of the institution of slavery and how much of a business is, they rely on female slaves to birth more children so they can get more future slaves to get more slaves. So that's why they pop up. Sometimes you hear these stories about Black women have all these children, and they use those children for capitalist reasons, and sometimes you hear about the separation of families when it comes to this current immigration crisis. There were separations of families back during slavery too. Like there were children that never got to meet their parents. There were children that never got to meet their mothers back then too. They were sold into slavery and never got to see their families again, which is very heartbreaking. I think Frederick Douglass, I don't know if he met his mother, but I know he never knew his birthday. So considering that, it's probably tough to have like a relationship as important as a mother. So um And then let me see if there's a quote that stuck out to me in those. Yeah, yeah. Davis said, um, ideological exaltation of motherhood, as popular as it was during the 19th century, did not extend to slaves. In fact, in the eyes of the slaveholders, slave women were not mothers at all. They were simply instruments guaranteeing the growth of the slave labor force. They were breeders, animals whose monetary value could be precisely calculated in terms of their ability to multiply their numbers. So, talking about the dehumanization of people that were enslaved, they don't see them as women birthing children. They see them as machines generating more potential machines. So a slave producing more slaves, as I said. And let me see, is there anything else I pointed out in that? I don't think that, I think that was, oh, this paragraph. So this was a good paragraph. The cleavage between the home and the public economy brought on by industrial capitalism established female inferiority more firmly than ever before. Woman became synonymous in the prevailing propaganda with mother and housewife, and both mother and housewife bore the fatal mark of inferiority. But among black female slaves, this vocabulary was nowhere to be found. The economic arrangements of slavery contradicted the hierarchical sexual roles incorporated in a new ideology. Male-female relations within the slave community could not, therefore, conform to the dominant ideological pattern. So she was talking about what white women were pretty much advocating for during that early suffragette movement about the not being in the boxes of being a housewife and a mother. But black women, especially when they were enslaved, they didn't have that. Um, uh, they didn't have that. It's pretty much a luxury that what they're saying. What the white women were pretty much advocating for. So, like black women had to do things that are even typically what are men jobs and roles. So it's like it's not even just the fact that they don't want to be in these boxes, but it's just the mistreatment that they've been getting while doing all these jobs and the intense mistreatment that they get. So it's it's giving like a it's pretty much giving the race and class analysis to the white bourgeois feminist movement, early white bourgeois feminist movement was doing. And then there was the Moynihan Report, which I talked about in Michelle Wallace's Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. So that, for those who need a refresher, the Moynihan Report was by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. It was a report about this trend of black single motherhood, like where are the black fathers and all that stuff. And it's not taking consideration that black men are an oppressed demographic as well. So it's the destruction of the black family is because of single black mothers. So that's what the report was inciting. So it's pretty much an anti-black woman analysis that the report was giving. So Davis gave some critique of that, and then she was talking about this felt the need for a specific type of black family. So pretty much the idea of the importance of a nuclear family structure. So you need your mom, you need your dad, you need children. And the thing is, not everyone is going to live their life that way. So it's pretty much saying if you have all of these, you have the American dream and you succeed and you accomplish so much. You deserve so much value from that. And Davis was pretty much pushing back on that, and how that messaging is damaging to black women, because a lot of the things that black women endured a nuclear family isn't gonna solve all their problems. So that's what Davis was pretty much going about. And then she talked about how back in slavery there was like a kinship between black men and black women at that time, because they were both having similar experiences, considering black men went through slavery in a different way than what black women went through, but they do understand that there is a common enemy, and they have a common exploitation system, which was the capitalist slave structure. And then Davis said, if black women bore the terrible burden of equality and oppression, if they enjoyed equality with their men in their domestic environment, then they also asserted their equality aggressively in challenging the inhuman institution of slavery. They resisted the sexual assaults of white men, defended their families, and participated in work stoppages and revolts. So she's pretty much talking about the different relationships between white men and white women, and the difference between black women and black men, because black men and black women, they got different stories, they got different issues, but they understand that they have a common enemy. But white women and white men, they are the enemy. That's pretty much what Davis was going about. And white women, they need to realize that the same enemy that's putting black men and black women in these positions is the same enemy that's putting them in subjugated positions, the mother and the housewife boxes. And then this was a very good history lesson that I'm getting from here. Davis was talking about the black women that were resisting slavery. She was talking about the abolitionist movement, and there was this woman named Anne Woody. Let me see. Do I have her? I marked her name somewhere. But she was talking about a lot of the abolitionists during that time. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and I've learned these two sisters, Sarah Grimke and Angelina Grimke. I think they're white women, but they're abolitionists, and they make sure to center black women in their work through the suffragette movement and the abolitionist movement. So they understand, like, to get into the most exploited and the most oppressed experiences is when everyone wins. So tackling those issues is our way to get to the freedom and liberation. And Anne Wood is a black woman who is a notable abolitionist. Davis said this woman's repeated efforts to escape from the domination of her South Carolina master earned her so many floggings that a finger could not be laid between the cuts. So she's talking about Anne Wood, who was trying to run away from her slave masters. So I think Sarah Grimke and Angelina Grimke looked into Anne Wood's situation and understand, like, to complete the mission of abolition and suffrage jet movements is to look into the experiences of black female slaves. And she was talking about the notable efforts that black women were doing to combat slavery, and how that tied to, like, prior to colonialism, the Dahomey tribe were female warriors. She was talking about that, the Maroon movement. She also talked about the importance of literacy, how it was important for people such as Nat Turner and Frederick Douglass. They had the pleasure of learning to read and write, and that led them to be the most notable abolitionists in that time. So she's talking about the importance of literacy and teaching slaves and black people in general how to read and write. And then she talked about Harriet Tubman, and and pretty much talk about the courage that she took to go use the Underground Railroad to take so many, like, thousands of slaves to freedom and emancipation. And she was talking about how trigger warning, rape and sexual assault. It's going to be mentioned in notable times in this video. How rape was used as state violence. So rape was pretty much used um, to reaffirm slaves to be in their subjugated places. So white masters, they use it as, they use rape as punishment, so as carceral punishment, which is you can go into our prison industrial complex today. Like, remember, I think it was Ashada, how she talked about the internal search, and Angela Davis talked about this in our Prison Obsolete. So it talks about how rape culture is so normalized from the experience of the oppressed that it's like, think about something as like prison. Like, there's sexual violence of prisoners in prison. Like, that's something that's existing till today. So so that's pretty much the gendered analysis into the institution of slavery. And then she was talking about white women in the abolitionist movement. So she talked about Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it's claimed to be like the book that started the Civil War, but it was pretty much like the discourse surrounding Uncle Tom's Cabin that led to like certain ideas to be passed around, and noted that slavery have to be abolished, and people had to be emancipated from it. So so Davis noted how the story of Eliza and Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I think Eliza was a light-skinned a mulatto woman, and pretty much how that story pretty much helped white women resonate with Uncle Tom's Cabin and encourage them to go to the abolitionist movement, even though it's like, why it took a character to make y'all understand that. So, but things had to be done the way it had to be done. So that pretty much motivated white women to be in the abolitionist movement. So there was a lot of white women that were abolitionists, like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which we'll get onto later on. But a lot of white women connected how to get freedom in their suffragette movement. They look into other movements, and the abolitionist movement was something that they paid attention to and realized that they had to be in solidarity with people that were going through a different type of violence that they were going through. All right, so that's the end of chapter 1. So chapter 2 is titled The Anti-Slavery Movement and the Birth of Women's Rights. So it's going into the women's and abolitionist movement in the 1830s. Let me see. I highlighted something. Yeah, this paragraph. While men had tilled the land, often aided by their wives, the women have been manufacturers, producing fabric, clothing, candles, soap, and practically all the other family necessities. Women's place had indeed been in the home, but not simply because they bore and reared children or ministered to their husbands' needs. They had been productive workers within the home economy, and their labor had been no less respected than their men's. When manufacturing moved out of the home and into the factory, the ideology of womanhood began to raise the wife and mother as ideals. So we'll get into more later, but this sets in tone of like how something like housework, which are something you can argue that everybody should learn, but once it's become once industrialization was happening, and like you had like stuff like nannies, housemaids, and stuff like that, domestic servants and domestic workers, and those tend to be black women taking those jobs. But when it comes to like surviving off of that, black women, it was hard for black women to make ends meet. And but those were like the only positions they were accepted to. They were because of racism and misogyny and misogynoir and classism, and guaranteed like in considering like it was hard for black women to get the education that they need. So this is like the only jobs they were quote unquote qualified for. And then tied that to their experiences during slavery. And then we get into the how white women were advocating for change, and especially in the North. So there was this woman named Prudence Crandall. So she was a good person. She was a teacher, and she was trying so hard to get black women and girls their right to education. So she literally created a school for black girls and try to get and organize that together and get people mobilized to do that. So I learned that she's pretty cool. And then there was Mrs. Charles Harris, um, who pretty much inspired Prudence Crandall to take this action and acknowledge her status as a white woman who has certain resources, but was able to pull a school off. So I think that was a good example of such camaraderie and solidarity between black women and white women, because there are moments where they happen, even though notable feminist movements, black women weren't included in those spaces, but there were moments where white women and black women, once they got together, they were able to make change happen. And that's the pretty much the thing, is that white people had to hold themselves accountable and hold themselves responsible for the needs that black communities need. So Prudence Crandall is a notable example of that. And then William Lloyd Garrison. For those who know the magazine, I think it was the Nation magazine. It used to be called The Liberator, and The Liberator was an abolitionist newspaper. So abolitionist media was becoming prevalent then, and it's notable for documenting social movements and stuff like that. So along with the abolition movement, there were the housewife protests. So it was pretty much like strikes for that women organized to trying to get recognized for being human beings and getting their needs met and receiving compensation that they believe that they deserve. So that was happening. And then there was this woman named Lucretia Mott, who I didn't know until reading this book, who was talking about these movements and how there was a lack of race analysis on that. So her experience helped generate a race analysis to the housewife box. And then let me see if there were any quotes that stuck out to me. Yeah, right. Yeah, right here. The anti-slavery movement offered women of the middle class the opportunity to prove their worth according to standards that were not tied to their roles as wives and mothers. In this sense, the abolitionist campaign was a home where they could be valued for their concrete works. Indeed, their political involvement in the battle against slavery may have been as intense, as passionate, and as total as it was because they were experiencing an exciting alternative to their domestic lives, and they were resisting an oppression which bore a certain resemblance of their own. Furthermore, they learned how to challenge male supremacy within the anti-slavery movement. They discovered that sexism, which seemed unalterable inside their marriages, could be questioned and fought in the arena of political struggle. Yes, white women would be called upon to defend fiercely their rights as women in order to fight for the emancipation of black people. So that's the importance of having a collective struggle, because if it wasn't for the abolitionist movement, we wouldn't have these conversations about gender equity, gender equality, and gender liberation if it wasn't for if the white women during those times didn't work with the abolition anti-slavery movements. And same thing for the anti-slavery and abolitionist movement. Having a gendered analysis helps generate possibilities of what and visions of what emancipation could look like. And then and let me see. Was that it? Yep. I think that was it. So we get into Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who were, I don't think I can say anything that can pay the respects that these women did during the abolitionist and suffragette movement, but y'all should look up Sarah and Angelina Grimke, because they were some warriors, and they pulled no strings. They did what they had to do. They fought the good fight. They were notable. They had so many speeches, and it's like white people have no choice but to listen to them, and they were able to convince politicians and stuff to get having the oppressed to have their voices heard and get the assistance that they needed. And yeah, I just think I can't say anything that'll pay respects to what these women have done, but they were pretty cool. They were pretty cool, and they should get their attention in Women's History Month. So that was it for chapter 2. And chapter 3 is titled Class and Race in the Early Women's Rights Campaign. So Davis was talking about the misogyny that was going on in the anti-slavery organizations. So even though things wouldn't have happened if they did work together, there was still some hostility from people that were in anti-slavery movements and their thoughts about women. So that was something that it got very intense, that they had to create like a female anti-slavery league. So there were women-focused anti-slavery discourse. So they felt like that had to happen. So that's like pretty much the thing about organizing. Like sometimes you have to organize your own groups, even if stuff like an organization already exists. If they don't have the analysis, if they don't have the same agenda, if they don't have the politics that they need, sometimes you have to create your own. And that's the truth and the reality of it all. You just have to get people together, get the money together, see who invest in that, and boom, you got the organization that you run and needed, and where you got the most autonomy in. So that's what Davis was talking about here. And I think Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they created those organizations. So it's important to have that gendered analysis, even if it came from like a white woman. Who it's important to have people with resources to make something like that happen. And then they were talking about the suffrage involvement. Then she was talking about the suffrage involvement for Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass they said he's the most notable male feminist during that time. Like, I think that it's good because, like, you need to have someone with the status of like Frederick Douglass, who got the power that he had, who got the privilege that he had because he's a man to hold others accountable and challenge yourself and unlearn the misogyny that you've learned, and advocate for the rights of women. So that's pretty much what was significant about that moment. And then she was talking about how to tie the experiences of labor to textile mills, textile mills industry, which is notable for women workers to be taken into. The exploitation that they went through is important to talk about their conditions, because they work so long but get paid so little, and paid little to none at all. And it's pretty much slavery without the way we're talking about American chattel slavery as we are right now. So she's talking about how that's an exploitation that needs to be eradicated. So there were strikes that were organized back then, and there were also conversations and ideas flowing through this annual conference called the Seneca Falls Convention, which I think is mainly for suffragists. So it mainly talks about women issues. So and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they're like the most notable leaders that were organizing that. And then we're getting into the misogynoir from the abolitionist movement and the suffrage movement. So there were no black women that were in discussion rooms in certain circles, but when this woman, wait a minute. So for example, Frederick Douglass' daughter, Maria Stewart, was denied entry to a certain school, and it was a school for girls, and she was not allowed to go into it because of early Jim Crow segregation laws, and there were no white women that were fighting on her behalf. That's pretty much an example of using that's pretty much white feminism, and how white feminism is pretty much more toward pretty much a loyalty to white supremacy. And I forgot which book that was talking about. I think it was Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider, and Michelle Wallace's Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, that tied into how white feminism is not gonna liberate all women. It's pretty much a loyalty to white supremacy. That's pretty much what white bourgeois feminism is. And then Sojourner Truth, who y'all need to get into her Ain't I a Woman speech, because she is a very good orator. She's a very good speaker. Let me see if I can find the page of the page that she was talking about, where she was talking about this, is right here. So Sojourner Truth, it's an excerpt in Ain't I a Woman speech. She said, "I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen them most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" So that's a race and class analysis that the feminist movements needed. They needed to hear that. So Sojourner Truth, yes, get into her abolitionist and suffragist intersectionality blueprints. So yeah, that's her. So it's pretty much going into the importance of developing an analysis on the experiences of Black women to social justice movements and abolitionist and suffragist movements. And yeah, Davis said here, even the most radical white abolitionists, basing their opposition to slavery on moral and humanitarian grounds, failed to understand that the rapidly developing capitalism of the North was also an oppressive system. So, pretty much talking about just slavery in the South is the only thing that needs to be focused on, and that ties into like how today, the white leftists and Ashada Shakur touched on this too, about this focus on class and focus on just focusing on a single issue without the analysis of another and how they're tied together. So that's intersectionality. So yeah, Davis said they viewed slavery as a detestable and inhuman institution, an archaic transgression of justice, but they did not recognize that the white worker in the North, his or her status as free laborer notwithstanding, was no different from the enslaved worker in the South. Both were victims of economic exploitation. So, slavery, yeah, slavery in the South was bad, but there also was slavery in the North that wasn't called slavery. We just called it labor exploitation and worker struggle and about a struggle for workers' rights. And she said like a lot of abolitionist movements, they failed to make those connections, so it was it's hard to like get people together on making these things clear. And that was that. And then Davis said the leaders of the women's rights movement did not suspect that the enslavement of black people in the South, the economic exploitation of northern workers, and the social oppression of women might be systematically related. Within the early women's movement, little was said about white working people, not even about white women workers. Though many of the women were supporters of the abolitionist campaign, they failed to integrate their anti-slavery consciousness into their life analysis of women's oppression. So it's pretty much talking about abolition, even today. Like I'm thinking about Marion Kaba and how about prison abolition. Like abolition isn't just that certain institution; it's the culture that needs to be abolished. It's the politics that need to be abolished, and it's the behaviors that need to be abolished. It's the legitimization of the state that needs to be abolished. That's what Davis was going into. Is not just that system and how that's operating. It's the macro and holistic society and how that society is complicit in it that needs to be abolished. So that was that. And once people were discussing that more and more and getting into concept analyzation and applying concepts, the Civil War was generating, and then there was Emancipation Proclamation that freed people that were subjected to American chattel slavery. And that was it for chapter 3. So let me see. I'm probably going to do chapter 4 and then chapter 5, and then that'll be it for this video, because I'm thinking of making this either a 3 or a 4-parter. So no, it might be a 2 or 3-parter. It might be a 2-parter, but we'll see. But chapter 4 is titled Racism and the Women's Suffrage Movement. So talking about how white suffragists and how they're complicit, and the anti-racist and how they're complicit in the racist and exploitative system that they're trying to combat in their circles. She was talking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton's racism, and let me see. Yeah, Davis said, at the outbreak of the Civil War, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had urged her feminist colleagues to devote all their energies during the war years to the anti slavery campaign. Later, she argued that women's rights advocates have committed a strategic error in subordinating themselves to the cause of abolitionism, alluding in her reminiscence to the 6 years women held their own claims in abeyance to those of the slaves in the South. She conceded that they were highly praised in Republican circles for their patriotic activism, but when the slaves were emancipated, she lamented, and these women asked that they should be recognized in the Reconstruction as citizens of the Republic, equal before the law. All these transcendent virtues vanish like dew before the morning sun. According to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the moral to be drawn from white women's Civil War experiences was that women should never labor to second man's endeavors and exalt his sex above her own. So she's talking about how Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she tried to have this hierarchy. She wants to uphold this hierarchy of white men, white women, men, black women. And so she feel like I think in conversations right now it's like we should worry about gender first. We should be worried about race first or something like that. And she needs to understand that all of these are tied together. You don't have to focus on one. You can pretty much just walk and chew gum. Like, you have to understand how all these y'all are subjected to the same exploitative system. Like there are white men that are being exploited in this system as well. So it's like you can't just focus on your certain identity and think just because you have that identity, your rights need to be prioritized before a person who's has gone through the same oppressive system as you has a certain type of violence that went through a certain type of violence and within that system, but we're only prioritizing you because you're a white woman. So that's what was so contradictive, and it surprises me that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were abolitionists, but they had their own racism. So it tells you, like, you can claim to understand racism, misogyny, and all these systems of oppression if you're not untackling how that oppression has been affecting you and how you and the behaviors that you've been socialized to accept and deem acceptable. And then there was the black men's suffrage because of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which guaranteed the right to vote, and then they have equal rights under the law. So black men were citizen because because there was convict leasing and black codes that were still going on, and Jim Crow segregation and lynching that was still going on, but they were recognized in the Constitution, as if that's really doing anything for black men. But white women were using that to scapegoat why to justify their racism. So it was interesting how they were using that. And Davis was talking about how it was going into arguments for black electoral power. So pretty much the importance of having your voice heard in electoral spaces and civic engagement and all that stuff, even though you can argue today how some of the methods aren't working no more, like the system doesn't serve us no more, but they see like electoralism as an outlet to be granted freedom. And Douglas, he wasn't like a radical, but he sees like something as important. And let me show y'all what Susan B. Anthony was saying about black men being accepted to the ballot. She said, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work for or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman." and the woman she's talking about is white bourgeois woman. Mrs. Stanton made derogatory references to Sambo and the enfranchisement of Africans, Chinese, and all the ignorant foreigners the moment they touch our shores. She warned that the Republicans' advocacy of manhood suffrage creates an antagonism between black men and all women that will culminate in fearful outrages on womanhood, especially in the southern states. So it sounds like a Trump supporter. like, like y'all out here trying to advocate for women and trying to tackle this oppressive system. Don't see how it's important for oppressed people to that are not white women identified getting some rights. Like, I think you should acknowledge that how it's important that they got their rights with that without tackling down. Like, acknowledge that you do deserve some rights, but not trying to use racism methods to justify why you deserve your right for electoralism. And yeah, Davis said whether the criticism of the 14th and 15th Amendments expressed by the leaders of the women's rights movement was justifiable or not is still being debated, but one thing seems clear. Their defense of their own interests as white middle-class women in a frequently egotistical and elitist fashion exposed the tenuous and superficial nature of their relationship to the post-war campaign for black equality. So it tells you like the political shift that was happening before the Civil War till after the Civil War. I think everyone like after the Civil War was like, okay, slavery is over. White race, yeah. So the same thing Michelle Alexander was talking about in the new Jim Crow when Obama was elected president. Like, like there were still some things that slavery has contributed to. Like, it's literally ingrained in American culture, whether that's carcerality of it all, there's respectability politics, the xenophobia, and all of that they were literally using to justify their rights to vote. So it's like y'all not the abolitionists that y'all claim y'all are. So and she was talking about how it was important how black electoral power was focused because of the economic deprivation that black people were going through, and the 1866 Memphis and New Orleans riots. Like, there were a lot of racial violence that were still going on after the Civil War, and considering that 1866, the year after the Civil War, there's still a violence that black people were going through, and that was in Memphis and New Orleans. And then Davis was talking about the hegemony in the South had to be preserved by Northern capitalists because of their loyalties, especially to the Republican Party. So she was talking about how it was important to have, because the United States is a slave economy even to this day. So it was the government trying to figure out how to continue the slave economy after the Civil War, because we all know Lincoln emancipated the slaves for capitalist reasons, not for moral reasons. And it was still trying to use like things like jobs, industrialization, and prison systems and the military industrial complex, using those, which we have right now, using the slave economy to build a proliferation of literally a conglomerate of systems to mimic the culture that was exhibited during the slavery times. So whether that's killing innocent people in the United States and outside the United States, whether that's contributing to the carceral and labor exploitation through the prison industrial complex, and whether that's getting paid little to nothing when you're in domestic service or the culinary industry and cleaning industries, and really tying how slavery is literally like, y'all get my point. Like, abolition has to consider combating all of these things. So that's and Angela Davis is a communist. So that's kind of pretty much how tying how the relationship between communist parties and communist people to the liberation and freedom that oppressed people were going through. And then what was next? I think I said all I needed to say in this chapter. Yep, that was it for that chapter. So this is the last chapter for this video, and it's chapter 5, which is titled "The Meaning of Emancipation According to Black Women." So she was talking about Black women labor after emancipation, and the labor that they went through is pretty much it's still like the labor that they were doing before slavery, whether it was cooking, cleaning, washing, sharecropping, especially. She was talking about the sharecropping that was exploitation that was going through there, and I forgot what book I was talking about. The mistreatment that Black farmers got from the government. Like they went into sharecropping, which so slaves are pretty much working with their slave masters again. So there's the trauma that goes within that. So they rented these farms, and their former slave masters, they charged them for their experience in the sharecropping thing. They're getting charged to do work. So that's literally it's like worse than slavery. Like it's like you can like Michelle Alexander went into this and how it's talking about racism in the South and how that's significant, and especially for the Black women that went through there, because the sexual violence is still happening that Black women were going through post Civil War. And then there was the convict leasing system and the abuse they went through for during domestic service. And yeah, Davis said during the post-slavery period, most Black women workers who did not toil in the fields were compelled to become domestic servants. Their predicament, no less than that of their sisters who were sharecroppers or convict laborers, bore the familiar stamp of slavery. Indeed, slavery itself had been euphemistically called the domestic institution, and slaves have been designated as innocuous domestic servants. In the eyes of the former slaveholders, domestic service must have been a courteous term for a contemptible occupation not a half step away from slavery. While Black women worked as cooks, nursemaids, chambermaids, and all-purpose domestics, white women in the South unanimously rejected this line of work. Outside the South, white women who worked as domestics were generally European immigrants who, like their ex-slave sisters, were compelled to take whatever employment they could find. The occupational equation of Black women with domestic service was not, however, a simple vestige of slavery destined to disappear with the passage of time. For almost a century, they would be unable to escape domestic work in any significant number, so they couldn't leave domestic service, just like Black women couldn't. It was hard for Black women to escape slavery. A Georgia domestic worker story recorded by a New York journalist in 1912 reflected Black women's economic predicament in previous decades as well as for many years to come. More than 2/3 of the Black women in their town were forced to hire themselves out as cooks, nursemaids, washerwomen, chambermaids, huskers, and janitresses, and were caught up in conditions just as bad as, if not worse than it was during slavery. So it tells you, like, are we really progressing from what the American chattel slavery has done to people? Like, it clearly didn't in post-traumatic slave syndrome. It clearly didn't in the new Jim Crow, and it clearly didn't in our prisons obsolete. So when we hear like get over slavery, it happened so long ago. We're still suffering from the repercussions that slavery has put on not just the United States but all over the world. So and that's that. And let me see. And she was also talking about how the violence they were going through the domestic service, how that's tied to workplace harassment, and it wasn't called workplace harassment back then. But there were also street corner markets that Black women were going to try to find a job, such as being a housemaid or something like that. And Angela pretty much talked about how that's pretty much tied to slave auctions. Like you, like there, like whoever is the highest bidder can get the person that has the most skilled labor. And even though it's not paid as if it's skilled labor, but it's literally similar to slave auctions. So that's when she talked about the importance of unionization and the importance of union struggles for household workers. And we'll get into that, but there is a struggle, and it talks about the importance of having unions in your jobs, and how white women are also complicit in the mistreatment of Black women workers. So Davis said here, racism works in convoluted ways. The employers who thought they were complimenting Black people by stating their preference for them over whites were arguing in reality that menial servants, slaves to be frank, were what Black people were destined to be. Another employer described her cook as very industrious and careful, painstaking. She is a good, faithful creature and very grateful. Of course, the good servant is always faithful, trustworthy, and grateful. U.S. literature and the popular media in this country furnish numerous stereotypes of the Black woman as faithful, enduring servant. The Dilseys, the Bernices, and the Aunt Jemimas of commercial fame have become stock characters of U.S. culture. Thus, the one woman interviewed by Eaton who did prefer white servants confessed that she actually employed Black help because they look more like servants. They look more like servants. The tautological definition of Black people as servants is indeed one of the essential props of racist ideology. So she's talking about the mammy stereotype and pretty much the mammification of Black women. Like Black women look like they are dedicated servants because, and that stereotype exists because white people feel like that's Black people's place, Black women's place. They have to be servants. Like there's no other thing they can do other than be servants. And the government was operating like that, but it literally takes away all the humanity of those Black women, domestic servants. Like they don't have a life outside of their job, and sometimes they don't have a life out of the job. Sometimes they weren't there, they couldn't take care of their children as they desired because of the exploitation they were going through in domestic service. And yeah, that was it. So now we get into the importance of unions, and it was interesting. Unions, we all know, are important when it comes to addressing concerns in a job, such as teachers, nurses, and under other industries. But Davis was talking about the complicity of bourgeois white women were doing, especially when they're in these feminist. They have these feminist ideals. Davis said, this feminist activist was perpetrating the very oppression she protested, yet her contradictory behavior and her inordinate insensitivity are not without explanation. For people who work as servants are generally viewed as less than human beings, like slaves. Inherent in the dynamic of the master-servant or mistress-maid relationship, said the philosopher Hegel, is the constant striving to annihilate the consciousness of the servant. The clerk referred to in the conversation was a wage laborer. a human being possessing at least a modicum of independence from her employer and her work. The servants, on the other hand, labored solely for the purpose of satisfying her mistress' needs, probably viewing her servants as a mere extension of herself. The feminist could hardly be conscious of her own active role as an oppressor. And thanks to Angelina Grimke, she Angelina Grimke, who I mentioned, the Grimke sisters. Angelina Grimke called white bourgeois women out for that. So yeah. So and then after that discourse was the transition from the home economy to the industry, and how that became even more notable after World War II. So that's when you got if y'all seen the movie The Help, how those maids got into that industry, and then in the 50s and the 60s, after World War II, and thinking like all these industry jobs where people can get paid more, but black women had to go to certain industry, or only employed and allowed in certain industries, but domestic service is where they can only thrive. And I think that's also similar to like sex work, that only black trans women, pretty much black trans women, that's like the only job they can really get into compared to other jobs. So domestic service, for black women, particularly cis black women especially, but black trans women had to endure like the sex work industry, and this for survival reasons. So I'm gonna go into chapter 6 because that's very quick, and then that'll be end of this video. So chapter 6 is titled Education and Liberation, Black Women's Perspective. And this is when she started noted Ida B. Wells' contributions to the suffrage suffrage movement. And there was a conversation between Ida B. Wells and Susan B. Anthony, and Ida B. Wells read Susan. And Ida was pretty much, her focus was on the lynchings during the late 19th century and early 20th century, and how that's important for suffragists to pay attention to, because if you want to, because we're all fighting the same enemy. That same enemy is your brothers, your sisters, your mammies, your pappies, your meemaws, and all of that. They've been complicit in the lynchings of people, especially of black women. So you had to have that analysis to get the mission that you're trying to strive for. And and the thing is, white suffragists were notably indifferent to the racial violence. So the race riots and lynchings and the police violence that black people were going through in those times. White suffragists feel like that's not my problem. I don't have an opinion on it. I don't know what to do about it. But the thing is, you have to listen to people that went through a certain type of violence, and you have to pay attention to that, and work into how those politics, incorporate those politics into your politics and into your agenda, and figure out what it needs to be done to liberate everyone. And then Davis was talking about the post-war era, and how segregation was pretty much used to keep black people in their place, and put them in subjugated positions and inferior positions. And racism as we know it today exists. Like when it comes to how people went through in Baltimore, what people went through in Jackson, Mississippi, what people went through in Flint, Michigan, And that ties into like reparations and stuff like that too, even though reparations isn't going to solve everything, but it ties into like how the consequences of slavery literally contributed to a lot of anti-black violence, environmental racism, medical racism, scientific racism, um, like like it manifests in so many different ways. You can't just focus on the labor exploitation that black people went through. You have to get into like how black people are surviving and existing in the society right now. And then oh wait, I'm talking about chapter 7, y'all. so I'll probably get into more chapter 7, but chapter 6 was education and liberation, black women perspective. So Davis was talking about how important it was to prioritize education after emancipation. So she was talking about Prince Hall. For those who don't, he was mentioned in Lovecraft Country. If y'all ever seen Lovecraft Country, Prince Hall was mentioned in the show, and Prince Hall was he was denied entrance to a white fraternity, some white male dominated organization, and he had to create his own. So I know the Freemasons, that the he created like a Freemason to include black men to pretty much get like a sense of community going on through that period. And let me see, Lucy Terry, she was very she was very she was very important. I forgot what she did. But Lucy Terry was an a notable educator. And then there was Myrtilla Minor. So she was getting into the stories of those people and how they centered education after the Civil War, and it led to like HBCUs and all of that. So and she was talking about the camaraderie that black women and white women had to do to make education um eh, something that is opportunity for for black people to have a development, have well, not like an assimilation to the society, but recognizing something that they drastically need to get through society and survive, and not and think for themselves and be critical about everything and challenge the institutions that they're in. And yeah, Myrtilla Minor, she said here, as Myrtilla Minor struggled to teach and as her people struggled to learn, they all fought evictions, arson attempts, and the other misdeeds of racist stone-throwing mobs. They were supported by the young women's families and abolitionists such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, who donated a portion of the royalty she received from the sale of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Myrtilla Minor may have been frail, as Frederick Douglass observed, but she was definitely formidable and was always able, at less in time, to discover the eye of that racist storm. So, and then she mentioned the Freedmen's Bureau and Reconstruction and the creation of HBCUs, which I went into for W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, and how the government had the Freedmen's Bureau to figure out what to do with emancipated people that were enslaved, and how to get education on the forefront, because if you can't get educated, like there's not too much things you can do. So that's how we got to like HBCUs and stuff like that. So that was it. So the next chapter we'll get into for the next video. So stay tuned for that, and make sure y'all follow my reading list at Raisin Souls and my personal Instagram at Intellectual Alberts. It will be on the description box below, and yeah, stay tuned.